think about me coming from Aberdeen. But I did notice the last time I did a Zoom meeting, obviously the researchers in the Sunday Express obviously watched rather thoroughly. And then what I said was reported faithfully in the last edition of the Sunday Express, that it was a disgrace that I was playing politics with the COVID crisis to attack the Tories. So just in case the Mail on Sunday are watching tonight, I thought I'd give them a bit of the same. Because there's three things I wanted to cover really. One is the follies of the government. Secondly, I think is from where I'm standing at the moment, the inadequacies of the Labour opposition in terms of articulating what we really need in our communities to hear. And then thirdly, and most importantly, given the first two, the importance of trade unions being prepared now to step up to the plate, because the battles that we're already fighting, which as Coral and Warren have indicated, have shown some real victories, we're now going to need to see expanded on a national stage, because we're not just going to be dealing now with health and safety matters, although there is still going to be that to fight over, but we're going to very quickly be hurtling towards the public spending announcements in October that are going to see a new wave of austerity in and for the people that we care about, whether that's our public service workers, whether it is the people living in our communities. And I therefore want to just try to join up what I think it means we need to do about it. So first of all, I just want to start with what the Sunday Express said was an outrage, so I'm going to say it again. My own view in terms of what the COVID crisis has done is highlighted, lest we not forget, the devastation of the general election defeat that we suffered at the back end of last year. And I say that because I have no doubt in saying that the consequence of a Tory government, to my mind, at least, and there's lots of other things we can say, means to my mind there are tens of thousands of people today who have died as a result of COVID, who would not have died had we had a competent government that cared about people. And I think the facts speak for themselves. Coral's covered some of them, but whether it is the scientific evidence that says being late into lockdown potentially doubled the death rate, whether it was sending people in our public services into the front line without adequate PPE, which essentially sentenced them to fighting for delivering public services at a cost of their lives, whether it is the scandal of what happened in our care homes, where we have clearly seen so many deaths of people already in difficult circumstances that the government knowingly, in my view, left people brutally exposed. For all of those reasons, we have seen, I think, a government that is ideologically driven, that put its toe in the water with its herd immunity strategy, saw the backlash, but then decided, even though they denied it, to essentially carry on with that strategy, has cost working class people and their communities and frontline workers the ultimate price. And for that, I believe they should never be forgiven. But not holding a grudge and not forgiving somebody is one thing. We have to, I think, use this as in a sense, showing how high the stakes are to ensure that something needs to be done about them. And so I think that political point needs to be made because it has mattered for people. That then leads me on then to, I think, the quality of the political opposition that currently the government faced. And I have to say that, you know, from my perspective, the quality of the opposition at the moment leaves a lot to be desired. I don't think it is good enough when people who are suffering need to see politicians reflect their anger. They need to not be sitting on the fence waiting to see which way the wind is blowing. They need not to come out and claim a victory about the exam results, which was actually won by, I think, students and teachers and others making it clear on the streets how appalling it was. You know, where was the Labour Party's anger when the government was prematurely trying to force teachers and children back into school? You know, and why did we see the one person who was prepared to oppose that, Rebecca Long-Bailey, as Shadow Education Secretary, suddenly sacked in the midst of what we needed to see was strong opposition? Now, I don't say this in any way because I hanker after the days of Jeremy Corbyn, although I do. I say it just because, in my view, when we're suffering like this, the thing you need more than anything is politicians who are prepared to stand up with passion and actually call for what is needed, you know. So why have we not seen the opposition call for the resignation of the Tory politicians who are presiding over this mess? Why haven't we seen a clearer defence of those of us who are arguing that people should not be forced back to work? And why have we seen, I think, too much sitting on the fence? Now, don't get me wrong. I think there has sometimes been signs that things are getting a little bit better on some issues. But from my point of view, the reason that explains why Boris Johnson at one point had popularity ratings that made no sense given the chaos the government was facing, to me can only be explained because there wasn't enough political opposition, and therefore people were prepared to give him the benefit of the doubt. And I hope that we can learn from that, because what we need to see now is not just strong unions, but I think we need to see a radical opposition preparing the ground for elections that are to come. And I think it is important that those on the left are prepared to say that. I also would just say politically, as part of that, that the days of believing now that the UK is one nation, that the only government that matters is the government in Westminster, have absolutely been shown to no longer be the case. Devolution in Scotland and Wales has meant that the governments in Scotland and Wales have made far better decisions than the Westminster government has made for the people of England. And it has been better for people like myself, who are clinically classed as extremely vulnerable because I've had a heart transplant, to know that the government that actually represents me is still telling me to stay at home, when actually Boris Johnson's advice to people like me was to get up and start going back to work many weeks ago. So I think the fact that we've seen devolved governments do different things means that one of the things we're all going to, I think, have to work through is, whilst clearly our focus will always be on the Westminster government, battles are going to look different in different parts of the country. And I think for those of us on the left, there is no doubt that the huge issue that is coming in relation to Scottish independence and the elections in Scotland that are going to take place next year mean that socialists, whether they're in Thanet, whether they're in Carmarthen like me or wherever, are going to have to, I think, adapt how we make our arguments, just understanding that things are looking different in different parts of the country. And that then takes us to unions, which is the key point of tonight's meeting. And I want to echo Coral and Warren to say that where unions have been strong, where unions have been confident, we have saved lives and we have changed the very real conditions that people operate in. We've heard about it in the NHS, we've heard about it in education. I can tell you in my own union, the PCS, where we represent government workers, both in the civil service, in the wider public sector and in the private sector, that it is because of the actions of the union that we still have a situation where the majority of civil servants are still working from home. That despite Boris Johnson demanding everybody went back to work in July, we still have a majority of people working from home. We are supporting people individually invoking their rights under Section 44 of health and safety legislation to refuse to go in where sometimes they have been told they have to. And we have supported industrial action as part of our campaign to get better outcomes from employers, and it has worked. So, for example, for all the people in the private sector that we represent, people who are working for government but are unfortunate enough to work for private contractors, usually security guards, cleaners, porters, messengers, caterers, directly as a result of the union's intervention, nearly all the private contractors were forced to not pay statutory sick pay when people went sick, but to pay people full wages for the entirety of the pandemic. We were successful in ensuring that people who could not work either from home or in a workplace because of conditions they may have had were put on paid special leave for the duration of the crisis. We have been successful in closing offices where there has been an outbreak, forcing health and safety inspections, deep clean, isolation, track and trace. And we have been successful in doing that, in also forcing the issue to force some government departments to start recruiting extra staff because of the crisis our public services were in. When you just say that's just our union, and you then look at what Unite have done, what unions have done, whether it's in education, as we have heard, unions like the Bakers Union that have been heroically still fighting for the living wage for people working in areas of the private sector, I think you can directly see that strong unions have made a difference. And I think that very much is to be welcomed. But we've got to learn, I think, from how we won the things we won and the inadequacies of our own response for the period that is coming. And I'm a great believer in celebrating what works and where we win, but having an honest assessment where we haven't done enough where maybe we've been too timid or maybe we've got it wrong. Because if we keep repeating our mistakes, the members we represent will suffer in the months and years ahead. And therefore, whilst we've had this lockdown, unions have actually seen that others have been very much on the front foot. And we have seen, I think, a resurgence of activism and of people being prepared to take fairly dramatic action that's getting results. So we've seen the Black Lives Matter movement, for example. In the height of the pandemic, we have seen massive demonstrations for people fighting racism and actually saying we can never go back to what problems we've had before. And that has allowed us to have more confidence in the trade union movement on the back of Black Lives Matter, when we've seen chief executive after chief executive give warm words about how they support the Black Lives Matter movement, but actually preside over corporations where there is a race pay gap, where the majority of their black workers will be concentrated in the more junior grades, and where many of those black workers, because of the jobs they do, will often be in outsourced companies, not in key parts of the public sector. So that has meant that in my own union, and I don't think we're alone, the radicalism of the Black Lives Matter movement now has made it into our agenda. And it means that if we know that a black person is 4 times more likely to die from COVID than a white person in similar circumstances, health-wise and age-wise, then it must mean it is right that we force employers to put in place particular measures that are individualized for people with higher threats. Therefore, we have argued, and I know the NEU have done something similar, that when anyone is considering going back to work and we have risk assessments and health and safety inspections, there must be equality proofing and there must be individual assessments made for individual workers to take into account their own circumstances. And if that means more safeguards for our black members, then so be it. And if it's the Black Lives Matter movement radicalism that now needs to be expressed in the trade union bargaining agenda, we have to do that. We also have to, I think, learn from what we saw from students over the exam fiasco. And let's be clear, if ever there was another example of what happened as a result of the general election, we have seen decisions taken, because Gavin Williamson is obsessing about grade inflation, that actually were shown to prove that people in working class communities suffered most from their botching up of the moderation of exam results. Now, it is good that they were forced to back down, but now we have to see that victory extended in other ways. And that must include the right for people who, through no fault of their own, have lost university places, who now will see real pressure on them. The government must pick up the tab and must be prepared to put right the mistakes that it has made. But I take my hat off to every young person who was prepared to make a fuss and not go quietly. And I also take my hat off to all those trade unionists and education trade unions in particular who have stood with those students, because for many, this was ruining their life chances, because you have a Secretary of State who likes to do interviews with a whip on his desk for the people to see that he was once the chief whip and he knows all the government's dirty secrets. That bloke is not fit for office. And I would quite like to see the Labour opposition call for Gavin Williamson to resign, and the sooner he goes, the better. That leads me finally, Norman, into this conclusion that the fight for health and safety is far from gone. You know, Boris Johnson clearly has come to a conclusion that he wants to put in his own woke mind the economy before the health and safety of the people in our communities. And in a funny sort of way, we had our own debate at the TUC about the pressures on worrying about where the economy was going and over the question of keeping people safe. And I just want to declare my hand absolutely here, that if you believe that the two things at any stage come into conflict, health and safety and our well-being must come first, because nothing will wreck our economy more than a second wave in the winter that could see things get even worse and do damage to the economy that could go on for many, many years and many, many decades. So I don't buy into the fact that because we want to resuscitate the economy, it means low-paid workers who can work from home are suddenly told to get on crowded trains and go into London to buy sandwiches at Pret-a-Manger at lunchtime, because that in some way boosts the economy. If the government want to boost the economy, they'd give PCS members and health workers a double-digit pay rise so that those workers could spend their money and boost the economy through spending power, not by forcing them into an unsafe environment. So I never bought into this idea that we must take risks for the good of the economy, the way that I think we look after our people is to keep them safe, and to say we don't sit back and say we are neutral players in what happens in the economy, that we must take a robust position that, for example, if employers are using this crisis like British Airways to actually sack and re-engage people on the back of the crisis, what that means is Willie Walsh et al. Are putting the profits of their company before the well-being of our workers. Therefore, not only, I believe, should we be supporting Unite and their fantastic campaign to defend their members, but I think we have to say whether companies like that are fit to be allowed to operate in our economy, and whether or not our response should actually be, if companies behaving that way, then those companies, some of them, should be considered into a radical political alternative to be nationalised, where actually what they do can be put to the good of the communities and the people who use and work for them, not actually be seen as separate private entities too large to fail, and therefore they will be allowed to exploit this crisis to pour misery on the people who can least afford it. And that's my real finishing point. That we have battles now over health and safety. We have battles now where people are fighting for their jobs and are preparing for a difficult period ahead. But what we can also see is the government has indicated very clearly that the cost of this pandemic, which we know is running to billions of pounds, they will probably conclude, just like it was concluded after the 2008 financial crash with the decade of austerity that followed, that the people with the least must always have to pay the price to fix the problems caused by those with the most. And therefore, I think we can say with confidence now that we know there's going to be a public spending squeeze. We know that there is going to be, with mass unemployment, an attempt to use that to drive down wages, to drive down contracts and job security, to squeeze the funding in our vital public services. And the government will very quickly resort to type. Proof of the pudding, here's one example. The government decided to use the civil service as an example to try to force them to show everybody else that the civil service must go back to work. And they haven't been successful so far. But part of that was they decided to make a political point of reopening job centres, even though job centres reopening, job centres of course have been providing a service. PCS members have been at work in job centres throughout this pandemic, but they've been closed to the public in order to keep people safe. The government decided that politically they wanted to show that they would force a reopening of job centres, but their real agenda was they wanted to reopen job centres not for the good of the public, but because they decided to reintroduce the conditionality and sanctions regime that underpins its welfare state in order to move from what it had been forced to do in a pandemic, which is to allow people to claim universal credit without all of the pressures and sanctions that that regime normally has for people, including complete suspension of their benefits. That's an indication of where the government's going. 2.6 million people claiming universal credit. Many of them have never done it before, who will see in the coming weeks and months the true severity of our welfare state, when you can have your money completely sanctioned for 2 weeks if you are late for one interview, if you haven't shown that you've done enough to look for work. Many people who believe life on benefits, who've never been on it before, sometimes have bought into the Daily Mails where it's pretty soft and easy, are going to get a very difficult rude awakening when they see how harsh it is. Our job has to be to fight for a proper social security system that treats everybody with compassion and allows them to live properly when they aspire for better times. But it must also be a social security service where you don't force the workers back in to sanction people. You actually say those workers' job must be to provide for people when they're going through hard times. So I think we are going to see an attack on jobs, a freeze of pay potentially, a further attack on pensions, and we're going to see many employers try to use this crisis in the way British Airways are. And that's my final point. Is this me sitting here thinking of the worst because I'm in some way a miserable person who listens to Leonard Cohen all of the time and I want to depress people? No, it's because I just think we know what's actually coming. And here's the example. I have members on strike today in the Tate. The Tate is one of Britain's leading cultural institutions that shows some of the finest art that you could wish to see. Why are our members on strike? Because there's a crisis in funding in the culture sector. The government has given the Tate a £7 million bailout, yet the Tate has announced 313 redundancies of low-paid people working to serve people when they go into the Tate. It's a real example, isn't it? Who's paying the price of the pandemic? Not the chief executives of the Tate, not the people who can go on desert island discs and pick Billy Bragg as one of their songs because they're working class people at heart. I don't believe you can make the argument you listen to Billy Bragg and you're working class at heart if you knowingly sack 313 people who will now be forced onto universal credit. We have cleaners on strike today in their third week of an all-out strike who clean HMRC offices, a government service, who are not paid the living wage and who are on terrible terms and conditions with no job security. We are backing those strikes and we will support those members going on strike because cleaners deserve decent conditions as much as anyone else, even though employers often look down their nose at those cleaners. We are also today balloting nearly 30,000 PCS members working in job centres and universal credit centres because the government is now about to force them not just to go to work, but to extend opening hours, which will put people's health and safety at risk. They are some small examples just in our union, Norman, but I think it points the way that whether you work in the private sector, for McDonald's, for British Airways, whether you're in companies in retail that are looking to lay people off, whether you're in the public sector working for a council, in the health service or the civil service or anyone else who know that the starving of funding makes real pressures and you face an uncertain future. What it means is with an 80-seat majority and with an opposition that needs to find its radicalism, it means the trade union movement now is our best hope to really show that we are prepared to fight back. And I'll finish with this thought that if we ensure that our unions nationally and locally in places like Thanet are working together, supporting local campaigns wherever they happen, but also making sure that on an issue like pay or pensions, where we have millions of public sector workers in different unions, but who all face the potential of a pay freeze, and all of us who are currently being robbed on pensions by a government who's lost in the courts, but is now trying to make our members pay the price of them legally having to put right what they got wrong, obviously requires common and joint action. Because if teachers, civil servants, health workers and council workers were jointly campaigning and taking action over our pensions and our pay, our chances of winning are increased massively. So I've said a lot there, Norman. I've gone on, so I'm going to draw to a close, but I hope I've given some views really that I think we have to hold the government to account. We need a bolder opposition, but we need radical unions building on the victories we're seeing, but ensuring that if we do that together, unlike in 2010 when austerity came, where we didn't act enough together and paid the price, if we now commit locally and nationally to fighting together, we can see off Boris Johnson and we can ensure that after this crisis, we don't go back to business as it was for the Tories, but we see the type of society that we all know that we need, which must include decent jobs, decent contracts, decent pay and pensions, and delivering public services we can be proud of. And I'll leave it there.
All right, thank you very much.